The Roman Senate watched in stunned silence as Diocletian, wearing the purple robes of emperor, did something no Roman emperor had ever done before. He voluntarily gave up absolute power. It was May 1, 305 AD in Nicomedia, and the man who had ruled the known world for 21 years, who had saved the empire from total collapse, was walking away to grow cabbages in his garden. "If you could see the cabbages I grow with my own hands," he would later tell those begging him to return, "you would not ask me to give up the happiness of this place for the storms of never-satisfied ambition." The soldier, who had risen from slavery to become the most powerful man on earth, was choosing vegetables over empire, peace over power, mortality over the immortality of rule. His abdication was as shocking as his rise. Both defied everything Romans thought they knew about human nature and imperial power. Diocletian was born around 244 AD as Diocles, son of a former slave, in Dalmatia, modern Croatia. His father might have been a scribe to a senator, or perhaps still a slave when Diocles was born. The sources are deliberately vague. Later historians embarrassed by the emperor's humble origins. His mother was named Prisca, and nothing else is known of her. Young Diocles grew up speaking Illyrian, learning Latin as a second language, marked forever as provincial by his accent. In the rigid hierarchy of Roman society, he started at the bottom, with no advantages except his own intelligence and ambition. The Roman Empire of Diocletian's youth was dying. The crisis of the 3rd century had seen 50 emperors in 50 years, most murdered by their own troops. The economy had collapsed, with inflation so severe that trade reverted to barter. Barbarian invasions penetrated deep into the empire. Goths sacked Athens. Alemanni reached Milan. Persians captured Emperor Valerian and used him as a footstool. Plague decimated populations. Entire regions declared independence. What had been the greatest empire in history was disintegrating into warring fragments. Young Diocles escaped his lowly origins the only way possible for someone of his class, the army. He enlisted in his teens, probably around 260 AD, joining the legions that were simultaneously Rome's greatest problem and only solution. The army made and unmade emperors, selling the throne to the highest bidder, but it also offered social mobility impossible elsewhere. A competent soldier could rise regardless of birth, and Diocles proved extremely competent. He served under Emperor Aurelian, the restorer of the world, participating in campaigns that reunited the empire. He was at the siege of Palmyra when Queen Zenobia's rebellion was crushed. He fought Germanic tribes along the Danube. He learned not just how to fight, but how to command, how to manage supplies, how to maintain discipline, how to navigate the treacherous politics of an army that killed emperors as readily as enemies. By 283 AD, he had risen to command the Protectors Domestici, the emperor's personal guard, a remarkable achievement for a freedman's son. The crisis that brought Diocletian to power was typical of the year's chaos. Emperor Cyrus died mysteriously during a Persian campaign, allegedly struck by lightning, probably murdered. His son Numerian led the army back from Persia but died under suspicious circumstances, his death hidden for days, his rotting corpse carried in a closed litter to maintain the fiction he was alive. When the smell became undeniable, the army's commanders met to choose a new emperor. Diocles accused Aper, the Praetorian prefect and Numerian's father-in-law, of the murder. In front of the assembled army, he drew his sword and personally executed Aper, claiming divine justice. The dramatic gesture won the soldiers' approval, and they proclaimed him emperor. He took the name Diocletian, a more distinguished version of his birth name. It was November 20th, 284 AD. The son of a slave was now master of the world, if he could keep the position longer than his predecessors. Diocletian's first challenge came immediately. Carinus, Cyrus's surviving son, controlled the Western Empire. Civil war seemed inevitable. The empire would tear itself apart again, and whoever won would likely be assassinated within months, like so many before. But at the Battle of Margus in 285 AD, just as Carinus was winning, his own officers murdered him, possibly bribed by Diocletian, possibly acting from personal grievances. Diocletian was now sole emperor, but he knew that meant nothing. So, emperors died quickly in the 3rd century. His solution was revolutionary: divide power to preserve it. He appointed Maximian, a fellow soldier from humble origins, as Caesar Junior Emperor in 285, then promoted him to Augustus co-emperor in 286. This wasn't the temporary power sharing of previous emperors, but a permanent division. Diocletian ruled the east, Maximian the west. In 293 he expanded this further, creating the Tetrarchy, ruled by 4. Each Augustus appointed a Caesar as junior colleague and designated successor. The empire had 4 rulers, each controlling a portion, each checking the other's ambition. The Tetrarchy wasn't just administrative reform but psychological revolution. By dividing power, Diocletian made assassination pointless. Kill one emperor, 3 remained. By establishing clear succession, he removed the army's incentive to murder emperors for donation money. By creating multiple courts, he could respond to threats simultaneously across the vast empire. It was genius born from understanding that absolute power was absolutely vulnerable. But Diocletian's reforms went far deeper. He restructured the entire empire, dividing provinces to prevent governors from accumulating too much power. He separated civil and military authority, making rebellion harder to organize. He created a new tax system based on regular censuses, stabilizing revenues. He reformed the currency, ending the hyperinflation that had destroyed commerce. He established maximum prices for goods and services, though this proved unenforceable. Every aspect of Roman life was regulated, catalogued, controlled. The transformation of imperial ideology was equally dramatic. Previous emperors had maintained the fiction of being first among equals, preserving republican terminology while exercising monarchical power. Diocletian abandoned all pretense. He was Dominus Lord, not Princeps first citizen. He wore silk robes embroidered with gold and gems, a diadem on his head. Visitors prostrated themselves before him in the Persian manner. He claimed divine appointment, styling himself Jovius Jupiter's representative on earth, while Maximian was Hercules's representative. This wasn't megalomania but calculated theater. Diocletian understood that the emperor's vulnerability came from familiarity. Soldiers murdered emperors they saw as nearly successful generals like themselves. By surrounding himself with ceremony, by making himself divine and unreachable, Diocletian placed the emperor above assassination's easy reach. You don't murder God, you worship him. The military campaigns of Diocletian's reign were constant but successful. He didn't seek conquest but consolidation. He fought Sarmatians on the Danube, Persians in Mesopotamia, rebellious tribes in Egypt. He suppressed revolts in Britain and Africa. Each victory was credited to the Tetrarchy collectively, building legitimacy for the system rather than personal glory. When Maximian struggled against the rebel Carausius in Britain, Diocletian sent reinforcements without undermining his colleagues' authority. The great persecution of Christians, beginning in 303 AD, remains Diocletian's most controversial act. For most of his reign, he had tolerated Christianity, his wife and daughter possibly being Christians themselves. But Galerius, his Caesar, convinced him that Christians threatened the empire's unity, refusing to sacrifice to the gods who protected Rome. The persecution was systematic: churches destroyed, scriptures burned, clergy executed, Christians forced to sacrifice or die. Yet even here Diocletian showed his pragmatic nature. The persecution varied by region, harshly enforced in the east, barely implemented in the west, where Constantius Chlorus, father of Constantine, quietly protected Christians. When it became clear the persecution was failing, creating martyrs rather than compliance, Diocletian began moderating it. He was a pragmatist, not a fanatic, abandoning policies that didn't work regardless of ideology. The true measure of Diocletian's success was his survival. He ruled for 21 years without being assassinated, the longest reign since Antoninus Pius over a century earlier. The empire that had been disintegrating was reunited and stable. The economy that had collapsed was recovering. The barbarians who had invaded at will were contained. The army that had been kingmaker was controlled. He had achieved what 50 emperors before him had failed to do. He had saved Rome, which makes his abdication even more extraordinary. On May 1, 305 AD, in elaborate ceremonies in Nicomedia and Milan, Diocletian and Maximian reluctantly, under pressure, abdicated simultaneously. The Caesars became Augusti. New Caesars were appointed. Diocletian retired to his massive palace at Split in his native Dalmatia, built like a fortress but intended as a garden. He had given up power voluntarily, something no Roman emperor had done, something most humans seem incapable of doing. Why did he abdicate? Health problems possibly contributed. He had been seriously ill in 304 AD, but his subsequent 20-year retirement suggests reasonable health. More likely, he recognized what killed emperors wasn't just assassins but the job itself, the endless stress, the constant threats, the corrupting nature of absolute power. He had restructured the empire to survive without it. Now he would test whether his system worked. The test failed almost immediately. Without Diocletian's authority, the Tetrarchy collapsed into civil war. By 308 AD, there were 6 men claiming to be Augustus. Galerius and Maximian begged Diocletian to return. He refused, famously citing his cabbages. At a conference at Carnuntum, they convinced him to arbitrate but not to rule. He settled the immediate crisis, then returned to his vegetables. The man who had held the world in his hands preferred soil under his fingernails. Diocletian died around 311 AD, possibly by suicide when Constantine, son of Constantius Chlorus, threatened him for supporting rival claimants. Even in death, he defied expectations. Roman emperors were supposed to die in power, assassinated or in battle. Diocletian died in retirement, by his own hand if the sources are correct, controlling his death as he had controlled his life. His legacy is complex and contradictory. He saved the Roman Empire but transformed it into something unrecognizable, an Oriental despotism rather than a Mediterranean commonwealth. He preserved classical civilization but created the bureaucratic state that would strangle it. He stabilized the succession, but his system immediately collapsed. He persecuted Christians, but his persecution's failure convinced Constantine to embrace Christianity. He was the last great pagan emperor and inadvertently paved the way for Christian empire. What makes Diocletian extraordinary isn't just his rise from slavery to supremacy but his understanding that power's preservation required power's division. In an age of strong men who trusted only themselves, he trusted a system. In a culture that valued glory, he chose efficiency. In a position that corrupted everyone, he remained incorruptible enough to walk away. He proved that even in the Roman Empire's darkest hour, intelligence and determination could overcome birth and circumstance. The soldier who saved Rome knew something his successors forgot, that power is a tool, not a goal. He used it to stabilize the empire, then discarded it like a worn tool no longer needed. His cabbages might seem like bothos after imperial glory, but they represented something profound, the choice of creation over destruction, growth over power, peace over ambition. The slave's son who became emperor died as something even rarer, a satisfied man. William Marshall lay dying in his bed at Caversham Manor, surrounded by knights, barons, and bishops who had come to witness the end of an era. It was May 14, 1219, and the man who had served 5 kings, who had risen from landless younger son to regent of England, was facing his final battle. "I have served God as best I could," he said to those gathered, "and he will reward me for it according to my deserts." At 72, an almost impossible age for a medieval warrior, William Marshall was preparing for death as he had lived, with dignity, courage, and unshakable loyalty. The priest asked if he wished to sell his splendid robes to benefit the poor. "Be quiet, you foolish man," William replied with characteristic bluntness. "I have had enough of your advice. Soon I shall be able to do no more than give myself to God, and he will have me." The greatest knight who ever lived was dying as he had lived, on his own terms, owing allegiance to God and king but subservient to neither. William Marshall was born around 1147, the fourth son of John Marshall, a minor noble who held the hereditary title of Marshal to the king. Being fourth son in medieval England meant inheriting nothing. The eldest got the lands, the second might get scraps, the third might enter the church, the fourth got a horse, armor if he was lucky, and the right to make his own fortune. William's prospects were further diminished when, as a 5-year-old hostage during the anarchy, the civil war between Stephen and Matilda, King Stephen threatened to launch him from a siege catapult if his father didn't surrender Newbury Castle. John Marshall's response became legend. "I still have the hammer and the anvil with which to forge still better sons." William survived only because Stephen couldn't bring himself to murder child, but the message was clear: fourth sons were expendable. At 13, William was sent to Normandy to train in the household of William de Tonncarville, his father's cousin. For 8 years, he learned the arts of war, swordsmanship, horsemanship, siege warfare, tactics. But more importantly, he learned the tournament circuit, the grand melees that were part sport, part training, part business. Tournaments in the 12th century weren't the formal jousts of later periods, but massive mock battles where hundreds of knights fought across miles of countryside. Captured knights paid ransom. Their horses and armor became spoils. For a landless knight, tournaments offered the only path to wealth. William entered his first tournament in 1166 at age 19. He was unhorsed, his equipment taken, left to walk back in humiliation. But he learned, adapted, improved. Within a year, he was winning consistently. He developed a reputation for tactical brilliance, identifying weak opponents, forming temporary alliances, timing his attacks perfectly. He kept careful records. In one 10-month period, he and another knight captured 103 knights. The ransoms and equipment made him wealthy, but more importantly, they made him famous. William Marshall became a name spoken with respect across France and England. His tournament success caught the attention of Eleanor of Aquitaine, who in 1170 appointed him tutor-in-arms to her son, young King Henry. This was extraordinary elevation for a landless knight. Young Henry was heir to the Angevin Empire, and his military tutor would have enormous influence. For 13 years, William served young Henry, teaching him warfare, protecting him in tournaments, managing his household. When young Henry rebelled against his father Henry II, William faced an impossible choice: loyalty to his lord or loyalty to his king. He chose his lord, fighting against the king, yet somehow retained respect from both sides. Young Henry's death from dysentery in 1183 should have ended William's career. He had backed the wrong side in a rebellion, had no lands, no position. But Henry II, recognizing William's abilities and integrity, took him into royal service. The king, who had every reason to destroy William, instead elevated him, granting him custody of Pembroke heiress Isabel de Clare. The marriage would make William one of the greatest landowners in England, Ireland, and Wales. But there was a catch: William couldn't marry her until the king permitted, which Henry never did, keeping William dependent. The relationship between William and the Angevin kings reveals medieval lordship's complexity. He served Henry II faithfully despite their past conflict. When Henry died in 1189, abandoned by almost everyone, William was among the few who remained loyal, covering the king's body with his cloak, arranging his burial. Richard the Lionheart, the new king, tested William immediately, accusing him of trying to kill him during the recent war. William's response was pure martial: "If I had wished to kill you, nothing could have stopped me. I killed your horse instead to teach you a lesson." Instead of executing him for insolence, Richard laughed and confirmed him in all his offices. Richard also finally allowed William to marry Isabel de Clare, making him Earl of Pembroke. At 42, the landless younger son had become one of the realm's greatest magnates. But wealth didn't soften him. When Richard went on crusade, leaving England in chaos, William served as a justiciar, maintaining order through force of personality as much as law. When Richard was captured returning from crusade, William helped raise the enormous ransom, contributing heavily himself. Richard's death in 1199 brought William's greatest test. The succession was disputed between John, Richard's brother, and Arthur, his nephew. Many barons preferred Arthur, considering John untrustworthy and cruel. William chose John, not from love but from legal principle. John was the adult male heir, Arthur a child under French influence. This decision would define the rest of William's life, forcing him to serve a king he knew was disastrous because oath and honor demanded it. King John's reign was catastrophic. He lost Normandy to Philip Augustus of France. He warred with the Pope, getting England placed under interdict. He taxed oppressively, took hostages from noble families, probably murdered his nephew Arthur. Through it all, William served loyally, even as other barons rebelled. He fought John's wars, negotiated his truces, tried to moderate his excesses. When asked why he served such a king, William supposedly replied, "I gave my oath. That oath does not change because the man changes." The crisis came in 1215, when the barons forced John to sign Magna Carta. William stood with the king at Runnymede, one of the few loyalists remaining. But he also understood the barons' grievances, privately urging John to honor the charter. When John repudiated it, triggering civil war, William commanded royal forces with his usual efficiency. He was nearly 70, an age when most medieval warriors were long dead, still leading cavalry charges, still undefeated in personal combat. John's death in October 1216 left the realm in chaos. The heir, Henry III, was 9 years old. French troops occupied much of England, invited by rebelling barons. The treasury was empty, royal authority had collapsed. The barons turned to the one man everyone trusted, William Marshal. At 70, he became regent of England, effectively king in all but name. It was the summit of an impossible rise, the fourth son ruling the kingdom. William's regency saved England from disintegration. He reissued Magna Carta, winning back rebellious barons. He defeated the French at the Battle of Lincoln in 1217, personally leading the charge despite his age. Enemies called it the Fair of Lincoln because William's forces captured so much plunder. He negotiated the Treaty of Lambeth, convincing the French to withdraw through combination of military pressure and generous terms. He rebuilt royal finances, restored justice, prepared young Henry III for rule. In 3 years, he transformed England from failed state to stable kingdom. But age finally conquered the unconquerable knight. By early 1219, William was failing. He spent his last months settling affairs, dictating his biography to ensure his story would be remembered accurately. He distributed his possessions personally, his scarlet robe to the Templars, his best horses to his followers. He made confession, received last rites, died peacefully on May 14, 1219. His funeral at the Temple Church in London was attended by the king, the entire nobility, and common people who remembered him as protector of the realm. William Marshal's life spanned the pinnacle of chivalric culture. He embodied knightly virtues, courage, loyalty, prowess, courtesy, while navigating political realities that often made those virtues liabilities. He served 5 kings, Stephen briefly as hostage, Henry II, Richard I, John, Henry III, maintaining his honor while they often lost theirs. He rose from nothing to everything through skill, determination, and unwavering adherence to his oath, even when that oath bound him to unworthy men. What makes William Marshal extraordinary isn't just his rise from fourth son to regent but his consistency across that rise. Power didn't corrupt him. Wealth didn't soften him. Age didn't break him. He remained the same man at 70, ruling England that he had been at 20, winning tournaments, direct, honest, formidable, loyal. In an age of treachery, he never betrayed. In an era of broken oaths, he never forswore. In a time of brutal pragmatism, he maintained principle. His biography, Histoire de Guillaume Marechal, commissioned by his family, is the only surviving biography of a non-royal medieval figure. It preserves not just events, but mentality, showing us how medieval knights understood themselves. William emerges not as perfect but as consistent, quick to anger but quick to forgive, harsh in war but merciful in victory, simple in speech but profound in judgment. He was what every knight claimed to be but few actually were. William Marshall proved that the chivalric ideal wasn't just literary fantasy but achievable reality. He showed that a man could rise through merit in a world dominated by birth. He demonstrated that loyalty and honor weren't weaknesses but strengths that outlasted cleverness and treachery. He transformed from tournament champion to kingdom's guardian, yet remained essentially the same, a knight who kept his word. John Jacob Astor stood on the deck of his ship watching the Columbia River meet the Pacific Ocean, tears streaming down his weathered face. It was 1811, and his men had just established Fort Astoria at the mouth of the Columbia, the first American settlement on the Pacific coast. The German immigrant who had arrived in America with 7 flutes and $25 now controlled a fur trading empire that stretched from New York to the Pacific Ocean, from the Great Lakes to China. At 48, Astor was already the richest man in America. But this moment meant more than money. The butcher's son from Waldorf had claimed the western edge of a continent, establishing American presence on the Pacific decades before the Oregon Trail. Within a year, this triumph would turn to disaster as war and betrayal cost him his Pacific empire. But Astor would survive, adapt, and grow even richer, proving that in America, reinvention was the greatest fortune of all. Johann Jacob Astor was born on July 17, 1763, in Waldorf, a small village in the Palatinate region of. His father was a butcher, prosperous enough to feed his family but nothing more. Johann was the youngest of 4 sons, with no prospect of inheriting the family business. The Palatinate had been devastated by constant warfare, offering little opportunity for ambitious young men. His older brothers had already emigrated, George to England, Henry to New York. At 16, Johann decided to follow them, walking away from everything he knew with no money, no connections, and no English. He spent 3 years in London with his brother George, learning English and working in their uncle's musical instrument workshop. He saved every penny, living on bread and water, sleeping in the workshop. By 1783, when the Treaty of Paris ended the American Revolution, Johann had saved enough for passage to America. He boarded the North Carolina in November 1783 with a handful of flutes to sell and dreams of fortune in the new republic. The voyage was a disaster that became an opportunity. The ship became trapped in ice in Chesapeake Bay for 2 months. Rather than despair, Johann used the time to perfect his English and befriend a fellow passenger who traded in furs. By the time they reached Baltimore in March 1784, Johann Jacob had become John Jacob, and he had a new plan: forget music, pursue fur. Astor arrived in New York with his flutes and determination. The city had 23,000 people, still showing scars from British occupation. He found his brother Henry, who ran a butcher shop. But John Jacob had no intention of returning to his father's trade. He sold his flutes, used the money to buy furs, and began learning the business. He worked for Robert Bone, a Quaker fur merchant, sweeping floors, beating furs to remove moths, learning to judge quality by touch. Within a year, he knew fur better than men who had traded it for decades. In 1785, Astor married Sarah Cox Todd, a decision that revealed his genius for recognizing value others missed. Sarah was neither beautiful nor rich, but she had something more valuable: a brilliant business mind and connections to New York's merchant community. She brought a $300 dowry, which Astor used to open his own fur shop. More importantly, she became his partner, managing the store while he traveled, keeping books with meticulous accuracy, providing advice he trusted more than any man's. Astor's early fur trading was conventional, but executed with exceptional efficiency. He would travel to Albany, then up the Hudson and Mohawk valleys, trading directly with Native Americans and frontier settlers. While other traders cheated with whiskey and false weights, Astor dealt honestly, building relationships that ensured steady supply. He learned native languages, understood their protocols, respected their customs while driving hard bargains. By 1788, he was making regular trips to Montreal, the center of North American fur trade. The Jay Treaty of 1794 transformed Astor's business. It opened trade between the United States and British Canada, allowing Americans into the lucrative Montreal market. While established merchants hesitated, uncertain about international trade, Astor plunged in. He began shipping furs directly to London, cutting out middlemen, dramatically increasing profits. By 1800, he was worth $250,000, already one of New York's richest men. But Astor's true genius lay in seeing connections others missed. Ships carrying furs to London returned largely empty, wasting capacity. Astor began importing British-manufactured goods on return voyages. Then he noticed something else. London fur merchants were selling many furs to China for enormous profits. Why shouldn't he sell directly to China himself? The China trade was dominated by established firms with government connections. Astor had neither experience nor permission to trade in Canton, the only Chinese port open to foreigners. But he had audacity. In 1800, he sent his first ship to Canton, technically as an agent for others, but learning the business. He discovered Chinese merchants would pay extraordinary prices for sea otter pelts from the Pacific Northwest. A pelt bought for $1 from Native Americans sold for $100 in Canton. The profits were staggering if you could manage the logistics. Astor's solution was vertical integration before the term existed. He would control every step, buying furs in the American interior, shipping them to the Pacific Northwest to trade for sea otter pelts, sending those to China, using profits to buy tea and silk, selling those in New York. One voyage could generate 1,000% profit if everything worked. It required enormous capital, perfect timing, and nerves of steel. Astor had all three. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 gave Astor his continental opportunity. While others debated its constitutionality, Astor saw fur trading paradise, millions of acres of untapped wilderness. He founded the American Fur Company in 1808, intending to monopolize the entire American fur trade from the Great Lakes to the Pacific. His agents spread across the continent, establishing posts, making treaties with native tribes, pushing ever westward. The Pacific Fur Company, founded in 1810, was Astor's most ambitious venture. He sent 2 expeditions to establish a post at the Columbia River's mouth, one by sea around Cape Horn, one overland following what would become the Oregon Trail. Both expeditions were disasters. The ship Tonquin's captain was tyrannical, alienating everyone. The overland party, led by Wilson Price Hunt, suffered starvation, disease, and death crossing the continent. Yet both ultimately succeeded, establishing Fort Astoria in 1811. Fort Astoria represented American commercial presence on the Pacific before government even imagined it. Astor envisioned a global network, furs from the interior to Astoria, from Astoria to China, Chinese goods to New York and Europe. He was creating international commerce on a scale no American had attempted. For a brief moment, the German immigrant controlled trade routes spanning the globe. The War of 1812 destroyed this vision. Astor's partners at Astoria, learning of the war, sold the fort to the British Northwest Company for a fraction of its value. They claimed they were saving what they could before British warships arrived, but Astor suspected betrayal. He spent years in litigation, never recovering his Pacific empire. The loss was devastating, not just financially but emotionally. He had touched the Pacific and been forced to retreat. But Astor's genius was adaptability. Blocked from the Pacific, he consolidated control over Great Lakes and Mississippi River fur trade. He crushed competitors through combination of fair dealing with Native Americans and ruthless business tactics with rivals. He vertically integrated every aspect. His own ships on the Great Lakes, his own warehouses, his own retail networks. By 1820, the American Fur Company was one of America's largest businesses, and Astor was worth $2 million. Then, in 1834, at the height of his fur empire's power, Astor did something extraordinary. He quit. He saw what others didn't. Beaver populations were declining. Silk was replacing beaver felt in hat-making. The fur trade's golden age was ending. While competitors clung to dying business, Astor sold everything. Knew the peak. He had learned the immigrant's essential lesson. Knowing when to let go was as important as knowing when to hold on. Astor invested his fur profits in Manhattan real estate, buying farmland that would become Midtown. He didn't develop the land, just held it, understanding that New York's growth would make him rich without effort. He became America's largest landlord, collecting rents from properties that multiplied in value annually. When he died in 1848, his estate was worth $20 million, roughly $620 million today, making him the richest American of his era. Astor's legacy extends beyond wealth. He created America's first trust, leaving $400,000 to found the Astor Library, which became the New York Public Library. He proved that in America, birth didn't determine destiny, that an immigrant with nothing could build everything. He demonstrated that business success came not from exploiting single opportunities, but from seeing connections others missed. First to China goods to New York, profits to real estate. But Astor's legacy is also darker. His fur empire helped destroy Native American independence, making tribes dependent on trade goods, depleting resources they needed for survival. His real estate empire was built on brutal evictions and slum conditions. He proved that American capitalism rewarded ruthlessness as much as innovation, that fortunes could be built on others' misfortune. John Jacob Astor died on March 29, 1848, at age 84, surrounded by wealth but reportedly miserable, complaining about the price of milk while worth millions. The butcher's son from Waldorf had conquered American commerce, but perhaps lost something in the process. He had arrived with 7 flutes and hope. He died with $20 million and regrets about not buying more Manhattan land when it was cheaper. What makes Astor extraordinary isn't just his wealth but his timing. He arrived when America was forming, when fortunes were possible for those bold enough to seize them. He understood that in a new nation, everything was possible. The German immigrant could trade with Native Americans, sell to Chinese merchants, become America's richest man. He proved that in America, reinvention wasn't just possible but essential. That success came from seeing the future before others and abandoning the past without sentiment. Free men from the lowest rungs of society, Diocletian the slave's son, William Marshall the landless knight, and John Jacob Astor the immigrant, each built something from nothing that reshaped their worlds. A soldier who saved an empire, a knight who saved a kingdom, and a trader who built a fortune. Their stories illuminate the rare moments in history when merit could overcome birth, when determination could defeat destiny, when individuals from nowhere could create everything. Diocletian rose from the son of a freedman to emperor of Rome, saving the empire from complete collapse through revolutionary reforms. He divided power to preserve it, created bureaucracy to manage chaos, transformed the emperor from first citizen to living god. Then, having saved Rome, he did what no emperor had done. He walked away, choosing cabbages over crown, peace over power. He proved that even in the most rigid hierarchy, exceptional ability combined with exceptional timing could overcome any origin. William Marshall transformed from fourth son with no inheritance to regent of England. the greatest knight of his age. Through tournament victories, loyal service to 5 kings, and unbending adherence to his oath, he rose to rule the kingdom he had served. He embodied chivalric ideals in an age that mocked them, maintained honor when others abandoned it, died undefeated after a lifetime of combat. He proved that in medieval society's cracks, a man with sword skill and unshakable integrity could rise from nothing to everything. John Jacob Astor arrived in America with 7 flutes and $25. Died as the nation's richest man. He built a fur empire spanning from Atlantic to Pacific, traded with Native Americans and Chinese merchants, then abandoned it all for Manhattan real estate. He proved that in America's forming capitalism, an immigrant with vision and ruthlessness could accumulate wealth that European aristocrats couldn't imagine. He showed that seeing connections others missed, first to China, profits to property, could build impossible fortunes. These 3 builders shared crucial characteristics despite their different centuries and continents. All 3 possessed exceptional ability to recognize change before others. Diocletian saw that the old imperial system was dead, creating the dominate that would govern Rome for centuries. William saw that feudalism was evolving, positioning himself at the intersection of old loyalty and new law. Astor saw that America was expanding westward, positioning himself to profit from growth others couldn't imagine. All 3 also understood that rising from nothing required not just seizing opportunities, but creating them. Diocletian didn't wait to be chosen emperor. He accused and executed Eber, making himself the only choice. William didn't wait for lands to be granted. He proved himself indispensable through tournament victories and loyal service. Astor didn't wait for permission to trade with China. He created routes others said were impossible. Their rises also required extraordinary adaptability. Diocletian transformed from soldier to administrator to god emperor to retiree, mastering each role completely. William evolved from tournament champion to royal tutor to military commander to regent, excelling at each transition. Astor shifted from music to furs to China trade to real estate, abandoning each business at its peak rather than riding it to decline. But their stories also reveal the costs of rising from nothing. Diocletian saved Rome but transformed it into something barely recognizable, an Oriental despotism that preserved the empire's body while killing its republican soul. William served terrible kings to maintain his honor, enabling John's tyranny through his loyalty. Astor built his fortune on the destruction of Native American societies and the exploitation of immigrant tenants. They achieved everything but at prices that compromised their legacies. The 3 men also demonstrate different relationships with power. Diocletian sought power to save the empire, then abandoned it when the job was done. William accepted power reluctantly, seeing it as service rather than prize. Astor pursued power relentlessly, never satisfied, dying angry about missed opportunities despite unimaginable wealth. Their different approaches suggest that rising from nothing doesn't determine how one handles reaching everything. Their impacts lasted far beyond their lives. Diocletian's tetrarchy failed immediately, but his administrative reforms shaped Byzantine governance for 1,000 years. William's loyalty to unworthy kings helped establish Magna Carta and constitutional monarchy. Astor's business methods created the template for American corporate capitalism, vertical integration, and monopolistic practices. They built structures that outlasted them, systems that shaped centuries. The societies that allowed their rises were all in transition. Rome in the 3rd century was collapsing, creating opportunities for new men with new ideas. England in the 12th century was evolving from pure feudalism to administrative monarchy, rewarding competence over birth. America in the early 19th century was exploding westward, offering fortunes to those bold enough to seize them. Their rises were possible because their worlds were changing, creating gaps through which exceptional individuals could rise. Yet for every Diocletian, William, or Astor who rose from nothing, thousands of equally talented individuals remain trapped by circumstances. These three succeeded through combinations of ability, timing, and luck that couldn't be replicated. Diocletian happened to command the guard when an emperor needed killing. William happened to excel at tournaments just when they became profitable. Astor happened to arrive in America just as continental expansion began. Their stories inspire but also remind us that exceptional rises require exceptional circumstances. Their legacies pose uncomfortable questions about meritocracy. Did they succeed because they were better than others, or because they were better at playing systems that rewarded certain types of behavior? Diocletian succeeded through military competence and political cunning. William succeeded through violence sanctioned by social norms. Astor succeeded through ruthless business practices that would be illegal today. Their rises suggest that meritocracy often rewards not virtue but effectiveness, not goodness but results. The three builders also represent different kinds of building. Diocletian built systems, administrative structures that could function without exceptional individuals. William built precedents, examples of behavior that established norms. Astor built networks, connections between markets that created value from movement. Each type of building required different skills but similar vision, seeing not just what existed but what could exist. Their attitudes toward their origins varied significantly. Diocletian obscured his slave ancestry, creating divine mythology to replace humble reality. William never forgot being a fourth son, maintaining simplicity despite achieving greatness. Astor celebrated his immigrant origins, seeing them as proof of American opportunity. These different relationships with their pasts shaped how they exercised power and how history remembers them. The endings of their lives reveal their true characters. Diocletian chose to end in peace, growing cabbages, the slave's son finally free from ambition. William died as he lived, settling affairs with meticulous honor, the landless knight finally at rest. Astor died grasping for more, complaining about expenses while worth millions, the immigrant never satisfied with what he'd gained. Their deaths suggest that rising from nothing doesn't guarantee happiness at everything. Modern society still grapples with questions their lives raise. Should exceptional ability override traditional hierarchy? Can individuals rise without exploiting others' fall? Does merit justify methods? Diocletian's administrative genius came with religious persecution. William's military excellence enabled terrible kings. Astor's business brilliance destroyed indigenous economies. Their rises force us to consider whether ends justify means, whether individual success warrants social cost. Their stories also illuminate the relationship between individual achievement and systemic change. Did they rise because they were exceptional? Or did their rises make them exceptional? Would Diocletian have remained an unknown soldier without the 3rd century crisis? Would William have died a landless knight without the tournament circuit? Would Astor have stayed a village butcher without American expansion? Their lives suggest that greatness requires not just individual excellence but historical opportunity. The three builders prove that rising from nothing is possible but not repeatable. Their specific paths close behind them. After Diocletian, no soldier became emperor through merit alone. After William, no landless knight became regent through loyalty alone. After Astor, no immigrant built such monopolistic fortune through pure business acumen. They were unique products of unique moments, their rises enabled by circumstances that couldn't recur. Yet their examples continue to inspire because they embody the hope that birth doesn't determine destiny. In every society, those at the bottom look at these three and think, if them, why not me? The answer is complex. Because you don't live in a collapsing empire needing military salvation. Because you don't live in a feudal society where tournament victories matter. Because you don't live in an expanding nation where continents await claiming. But also because these three possessed combinations of ability, ambition, and fortune that transcend normal human experience. Their ultimate lesson might be that building something from nothing requires being willing to become someone from no one. Diocletian had to become divine emperor abandoning his humanity for the role. William had to become the perfect knight, suppressing personal desires for oath-bound service. Astor had to become the ruthless capitalist, sacrificing sympathy for success. They gained everything by losing themselves, built empires by demolishing their origins. The slave's son who saved Rome, the landless knight who saved England, and the immigrant who built America's first fortune. They stand as testament to human possibility and its price. They proved that in rare moments, exceptional individuals can transcend any origin. But they also proved that such transcendence transforms the individual beyond recognition. They started as men from nowhere and ended as legends from everywhere, gaining immortality by sacrificing the mortality that made them human. Their stories endure because every generation produces those who start with nothing and dream of everything. Most will fail, but a few will succeed through combinations of genius, determination, and luck that defy probability. These three did more than succeed. They built things that outlasted them, saved things that seemed doomed, created things that seemed impossible. They were builders who rose from nothing to construct the foundations on which later centuries would stand. In the end, Diocletian's cabbages, William's deathbed dignity, and Astor's final complaints reveal the deepest truth about rising from nothing. The rise changes you more than you change the world. They achieved everything they sought but became people they might not have recognized. The slave's son died an emperor emeritus. The landless knight died a legendary regent. The immigrant died America's richest man. They built their dreams but lost themselves in the construction. If these three titans who built empires from nothing have inspired you to reconsider what's possible regardless of origins, hit that subscribe button and join our community of history enthusiasts. Which builder's story resonated most with you? Was it Diocletian's rise from slavery to emperor, William's journey from fourth son to regent, or Astor's transformation from immigrant to tycoon? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And remember, history shows us that extraordinary rises are possible but never easy. That building something from nothing requires becoming someone you never imagined. Next week, we're exploring three more figures who defied their origins to reshape history. Ring that notification bell so you don't miss their incredible stories. Until then, remember what Diocletian, William, and Astor proved. Where you start doesn't determine where you finish, but the journey will transform you beyond recognition. The only question is, what are you willing to build? And who are you willing to become to build it?